Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this video series on data security for Microsoft Copilot for M365. If you are considering introducing Copilot to your organization, but have some concerns about data security, governance, or compliance, then you're in the right place. I'll keep the introduction brief. My name is Alexander, and I am a data security and compliance technical specialist at Microsoft Switzerland. The aim of these videos is to discuss some of the best practices you can use to adopt M365 Copilot in a safe and compliant manner, and how a few other tools, notably a tool suite called Microsoft Purview, can help. Let's maybe start at the beginning. As they say, a very good place to start. Copilot for M365 probably needs no introduction. Ever since its announcement, it has been one of the most anticipated Microsoft products ever. It is no doubt a powerful tool. But as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. And the more powerful the tool, the better we need to understand it and its best practices so we can use it safely and effectively. So, if great power equals great responsibility, let's maybe start our discussion with that. Responsibility. Specifically, who is responsible for what? To answer this, we use something called the AI shared responsibility model. If you're familiar with cloud computing concepts, then this will be nothing new to you. Simply put, the shared responsibility model splits responsibility between the AI provider, in this case Microsoft, on the one hand, and the customer on the other. Who is responsible for what then depends on the type of AI service and which part of the AI we are talking about. Let's maybe start with function first. Broadly speaking, we can divide AI services, and thus the responsibilities, into three parts. At the bottom, we can talk about platform. Now, with that, we mean everything that the AI actually runs on. So here we have things like the infrastructure, the data center, the hardware, as well as the creation and the training of the actual AI. Now, then building on top of that, we have the AI application. That's what the user sees and actually interacts with. And finally, on top of that, we can also be concerned about usage. So that's how we use this app here, and also how it is governed. And similarly, we can also divide AI services, the services that a provider provides, into three categories. Analogously to cloud terminology, we can distinguish infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. That's where the AI provider just provides the hardware and you have to create, train, and optimize your AI yourself. This is also sometimes called bring your own AI. Then there's platform as a service, where the AI provider already pre-builds an AI for you and obviously also provides the hardware for it, but you still have to configure it and build your own application to access it. An example of this is Microsoft Azure OpenAI, and you can use Power Apps to build an application for it. And then finally, there is software as a service, or SaaS. This is where the AI provider doesn't just supply the hardware and the pre-trained AI, but also the application to access and use it. Now, the topic of today's discussion, Copilot, is exactly one such SaaS AI application. It's a tool that's ready to use straight out of the box. And as such, as may be fully expected, Microsoft is fully responsible for, if we were to draw a kind of matrix here, then Microsoft, let's draw Microsoft in blue, is fully responsible, of course, for the platform, so for the running the AI, the hardware, and also pre-training it, but also for the application, so for building the app inside Teams and inside Word and Excel and so forth. And for usage, there it's a split, shall we say. Half of the proper usage responsibility falls on Microsoft, and the other half falls on the customer. So here we have obviously things like governance, what is acceptable use and so forth. This falls on the customer side, whereas some security controls and so forth fall on Microsoft's side. Now, this is relatively simplified, but for our purposes here, this model is sufficient. You can find more detailed descriptions of this online, of course. Links on that can be found in the video's description. Now, this video series is primarily focused on this right-hand column, and more specifically on the data security and compliance aspects of that column. The focus of this first video is the parts that Microsoft is responsible for. So these here, things like, how does Copilot access my organization's data? Where does that data move? Where is it kept? What does Microsoft do with that data? And so on. Discussing this green part of the upper right-hand corner, specifically things that the customer is responsible for and what data security and compliance controls you can apply, these will be the topic of the next two videos. All right, before we go any further, let's take a brief peek behind the scenes and discuss what actually happens in the background when a user issues a prompt to Copilot. We do this because it will help us understand a lot about what's going on and answer many questions, including from data security and compliance, along the way. So let's say we have a user. And this user issues a prompt to Copilot. The prompt can be, for example, summarize my last 10 meetings for me. And we have Copilot here. Now, the Copilot that our user talks to is actually only an orchestrator. It's a conductor, if you will, directing the opera. It will take the prompt from the user, and it will analyze it and will reason about it, figure out what the user actually needs and what information it requires to answer that. Once it has that, Copilot goes to the Microsoft Graph. And in case you have never heard about it, you can think about it, for the purpose of this discussion, as simply your tenant. Simply put, the graph contains everything. All your organization's files, emails, SharePoint sites, chat messages, logs, policies, everything. From this graph, Copilot will intelligently gather the information the user asked for and also enrich it with additional information that may prove relevant. This is a process called grounding. Now then, using the user's initial prompt and this extra information that it just gathered, Copilot sends everything off to the large language model, or LLM for short. This is the engine driving Copilot's output, the GPT model that is responsible for actually generating the answers the user wants. Otherwise, up to this point, all Copilot has is a user request and a spaghetti soup of useful information that it found during the grounding phase. It's up to the LLM to transform this into the human-readable output that the user expects. In our case, the summary of the last 10 meetings. Now, Copilot sends the prompt to the LLM, and the LLM in turn will work its generative AI magic and generate the requested answer, and then hand off everything back to Copilot. Once Copilot receives this answer from the LLM, it will perform a wide variety of post-processing steps, such as responsible AI checks. We'll briefly talk about those later. It will apply security and compliance controls, more about those in videos 2 and 3, as well as perform additional grounding calls to the graph to gather some more contextual information, such as links to references and the like. And then finally, at this stage, Copilot takes the whole package and returns it to the user. All of this, obviously, as you can imagine, is a heavy oversimplification, but it's good enough for our needs here. This allows us to answer many common concerns and questions, such as, the first and biggest one is, where exactly is my Copilot data and where is it going? And the answer to that is twofold. First of all, the stored data, the so-called data at rest, such as users' files, emails, and chat messages, those are all stored in the tenant, just like they always were. And conversations with Copilot, including generated summaries, interactions, chats with the Copilot, and so forth, they follow the same philosophy. They are stored in the tenant, specifically, if we're being very precise, in the user's mailbox in a special subfolder. In fact, we can call all of this here this left side, the so-called tenant boundary. Everything in here takes place inside your organization's tenant. The other parts of Copilot's functionality take place in what is called the Microsoft Trust Boundary. That's this entire part here. That is Microsoft's shared infrastructure where data can flow and be processed securely. At this stage, you might be wondering, why isn't everything done inside the organization's tenant? Because, unfortunately, the hardware required to run modern generative AI is unbelievably complicated and expensive, both to buy and operate. It can't be run inside a nicely isolated and tenant-fixed virtual machine. Having separate geo-fenced instances for each tenant would simply not be feasible. So in order to make Copilot possible and guarantee acceptable processing times, the prompt and additional data from the graph can therefore be sent temporarily to other data centers or even outside the country if needed, within certain limits, of course. For example, if your organization is in Europe, then it is guaranteed that the data stays within the so-called EU data boundary. So in other words, it doesn't leave the EU. Note that the data doesn't stay inside the Microsoft Trust Boundary. Data at rest is always stored in the tenant, but the data does flow briefly outside of it for processing. Now, for strongly regulated customers for whom this is not enough, there are additional data residency commitments available in the form of an extra service called the Advanced Data Residency Add-on. It's basically a paid upgrade where Microsoft provides additional guarantees on where your data is kept. Okay, then another common question is, how does Microsoft use my organization's Copilot data to train the AI model or the LLM? And the answer is not at all. The LLM that powers Copilot is pre-trained from data off of the internet by Microsoft, but the LLM itself, that remains static and stateless. Now, admittedly, Microsoft really loves to hammer this line home, but the phrase "your data is your data" is not just for show. As in, the data from Copilot is never, ever used to train the LLM. So this here does not happen. Okay? This is done because, as we discussed, Copilot's underlying LLM is shared among all customers. If we were to draw an analogy, then Copilot's LLM is a bit like a rental car. Many different people can drive it. If Microsoft added customer data to the LLM, users from other organizations, they might become capable of accessing your data. And that's obviously something nobody wants. It would be the equivalent of leaving a customer's personal information, such as a copy of their driver's license, in the Copilot rental car. Hence, why Microsoft keeps the rental car, Copilot's LLM, static and does not add any customer data to it. In fact, Microsoft even goes a step further. The LLM is actually stateless, meaning it suffers amnesia as soon as it has returned that answer back to Copilot. It doesn't remember any past interactions. Now here some people interject. If I chat with Copilot, it very much does remember what I talked to it about, right? It even allows me to ask it to tweak the answer. And doesn't Microsoft advertise that Copilot gets smarter over time and can learn or answer questions or compose emails in a more fine-tuned manner? Doesn't that mean that the LLM does keep and learn from my answer? But what I said earlier doesn't change. What is actually happening is a magic trick. It's a sleight of hand, so to speak. Remember what we talked about before, how Copilot goes to the graph in the grounding phase. Now, the chats with Copilot and its outputs become smarter by Copilot gathering past interactions in the grounding phase and enriching the user's prompt with that information before sending it off to the LLM. So it's not the LLM that gets smarter, it's the prompt to the LLM. The user's past interactions, recall, data at rest, is stored in the user's mailbox. and doesn't leave the tenant. The LLM itself never ever stores that information. That means, like we said, that the LLM and the neural network underpinning it doesn't change, just like the rental car in our analogy doesn't change. Sure, at times Microsoft makes improvements to the LLM, such as upgrading the model or upgrading the GPT version. This is the equivalent of putting in a better engine into the rental car. And yes, I know I'm stretching that analogy quite hard, but to emphasize, the LLM is always pre-trained off of data that are publicly available. It is not ever enriched with any customer data. All right. Now with that covered, we know where the data sits and where it goes. Now, at this stage, are there any edge cases or potential gotchas with what we just looked at? And yes, there are two prominent ones you should be aware of. The first is plugins. Everything we discussed so far applies only to the vanilla, unmodified version of Copilot with no plugins installed. This is important because it's possible to develop and use plugins for Copilot, and the framework for this is fairly open. Anyone can code pretty much anything into those plugins. While this allows a lot of creativity, this also means that these plugins have access to your Copilot data. And if these plugins come from third-party vendors, their Copilot data usage is obviously not governed by Microsoft's policies, and hence what I outlined here need not apply. In particular, third-party providers can take that data and store it. Therefore, I urge you to very carefully assess the data protection impact of any plugins you plan to use and read the data protection policies, especially that they provide, very carefully before you enable them. The second thing that many aren't aware of is that next to the Copilot responses that a user receives, there is by default a button that allows a user to submit feedback to Microsoft on whether a Copilot response was helpful or not, a thumbs up and down button. When a user clicks that button, Microsoft receives a copy of the prompt, the context, and the reply. Obvious as this may seem, after all, how could Microsoft react to user feedback if it never received the context of the interaction? But it is still something to be aware of. If Microsoft potentially receiving and storing, keyword here, and analyzing your user's Copilot prompts, context, and responses presents a data security concern to you, then this functionality can be disabled. Then your users will not see that button. Okay. Finally, before closing out this video, let's take a very brief look at Microsoft's so-called safe AI principles. You may have heard of these before. These are the guiding principles in response to certain prompts. These principles, just to briefly name them, are fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. In the domain of data security and compliance, these, as you can expect, become especially important. In accordance with these principles, Microsoft strives to ensure that Copilot isn't used for dangerous or even illegal purposes. So for example, how do I build a bomb is not something that Copilot will ever answer. This means that you are not starting from scratch when trying to make sure that Copilot remains secure and compliant. A lot of risky, dangerous, or even illegal interactions are already pre-filtered by Microsoft. As for how you can enforce your own rules, that's a topic for the upcoming videos in this series. All right, and with that, I believe we can conclude this first discussion on data security for Copilot. Like I mentioned earlier, you will find more information to everything we've discussed in the video description. Now, admittedly, the material covered here was a bit more on the theoretical side. We didn't discuss all that many settings or controls you can apply yourself to improve your Copilot data security compliance, with the exception of third-party plugins and the feedback button. Still, I hope that you found the overview we covered here helpful, in particular the AI shared responsibility model and how Copilot works in the background, what data residency guarantees Microsoft provides, and how prompts and user information flow inside the Microsoft Trust Boundary. All of these are essential knowledge to ensure that you can govern Copilot usage correctly and effectively. Now, please join me in the next video where we'll discuss in more detail what tools and settings you can use on your end to ensure a compliant and secure Copilot adoption. I hope I'll see you there, and until then, take care. Bye-bye.